we have Cindi Blyberg. Cindi is Senior Product Manager at OCLC. She's going to be extending the conversations that we've been having so far about how we think about and the development of and the maintenance of the systems that we have. Um, so Cindi, I love your backdrop. Fantastic. It's this is not the Dublin in Ohio.
No, it's not.
All right. So Cindi, I can see you. I can hear you. I
Great.
will fade away.
All right. I'm going to take a second to share my screen. And which one is it? I don't actually see one just for my slides. So, oh, hold shift to select multiple windows. I just updated Zoom, and I wonder if that is what's going on here.
If you'll give me a minute, Cindi, I'll see if I can bring them up.
No, we got
Yeah,
it.
that would be actually. Do you see the? You don't see the like big thing. You see the list of all the slides, right?
I see. Yeah, I see you in presenter mode. So if you, I'm sorry, not presenter mode. I can see your
Cindi,
screen.
your normal view. If you go down to the bottom of your screen and hit slideshow, you should be all right.
Yeah, as long as, oh, perfect. Yeah. I wanted to make sure that I have my notes in front of me as well. Thanks, Jill. Okay, so I am Cindi Blyberg, and I currently work for OCLC. But I've only been with OCLC for about 7 weeks, so I'm mostly going to be talking to you about my product management experience and technical experience when I was with SpringShare, when I was with SpringShare for about 7 years. And SpringShare makes applications for libraries. If you think back to Lauren's presentation, the pen slide on conference proceedings and what the purpose of those are, that was actually built in LibGuides, which is the content management system that SpringShare puts out, and one of the things that I was product manager of for a long time. Before that, I worked in academic libraries of various sizes, running IT departments of various sizes and responsibilities. So I am a technologist, but really I think I work best when I sort of bridge those two worlds between library and IT, between product and technical teams. That's, I think, where I feel most comfortable. So today I'm going to talk to you about 3 topics: keeping up, thinking about staff skills and responsibilities and knowledge, doing all of the things. The previous presenters have talked a lot about the various teams that are involved in creating and updating product. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how you juggle old requirements and new requirements, and also scheduling the disruption when you're ready to release features or product, what you need to think about, particularly in this post-pandemic, hopefully, world. So first of all, keeping up. Institutions must invest in their workforces to keep your skills current. Obviously, the technology staff have to keep current with coding practices, security requirements, accessibility, etc. And the product staff have to keep on top of industry trends, hone their management skills. But it's also important for all of these teams to understand what goes into making software from all of the sides. As technology changes and emerges, and as user needs evolve, systems must be upgraded, as has been previously mentioned, migrated and modernized. Examples of modernization can include transitioning to a new code design pattern, moving to test-driven development, or supporting a new format. It's important for institutions to provide training for these, but also to realize that incorporating these new things may extend coding or planning time. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a bit. An example, though, is a seemingly small new feature in the user interface may actually require huge backend changes, like new database fields, spinning up new servers to support delivery or storage of the new formats, a new database schema or data model, capturing and integrating more metadata, etc. And it's important, and speaking of data, it's important to understand the impact that your changes have on your data. Are you going to need to migrate it? Are you going to need additional data? And how do you support those things? Also, new movements and initiatives that have been mentioned before, accessibility, diversity, equity, and inclusion, can translate into new product and technology requirements. For example, libraries began incorporating user experience principles into product needs and evaluation in about 2008. And so it's important to think about how modern is your UI. You know, if our systems on our campuses are 20 plus years old, that UI is probably not going to be very modern. So what technical skills are needed in order to modernize the UI, but also what non-technical skills are needed to assess that UI and to define and test a better experience for your users. We've heard several mentions of accessibility, and accessibility is for everyone, not just to have your products be accessible, but for everyone on your various teams to internalize what accessibility is and why it's important. Including more than just your technology and product staff. Frontline people, for example, whether you're in a library and it's your reference folks, or you're a company and it's your support folks, they should understand what basic web accessibility is and means in order to create accessible content, to spot potential issues, and even to assist users who need access to assistive technology and need to use your content with assistive technology. It's also important for your needs to understand and keep up with changing accessibility guidelines. As Steph mentioned, at first it was 508 and ADA, and now we are the expectation is, it's pronounced WCAG, WCAG 2.1 AA, but there are also international accessibility guidelines that can be applied as well. It's important to know what your institution's targets are for accessibility, and how to code, test, document, and communicate your existing accessibility needs and what your remediation plans are for those. Often your accessibility plan is directly linked to revenue. Many institutions are no longer able to sign or renew contracts without a solid plan and documentation in place regarding how you're going to fix accessibility issues and how soon you're going to fix them. Also mentioned already is diversity, equity, and inclusion. Institutions really have to lead the way on this important topic in order to internalize how to address things like non-inclusive language, mitigate unconscious bias, and other work to further equity. And include marginalized communities. And it's also important to think about the various kinds of marginalized communities, not only communities of color and indigenous communities, but the LGBTQ community, and thinking about neurodiverse users is important as well. All of these folks will approach your products in different ways and have different needs. Thankfully, there is a lot of work already happening in our industry related to this, and information is readily at hand if you're ready to do this hard work. Security is a big issue. This is obviously more of a technical issue, but product teams also need to have a basic understanding in order to incorporate some security features. An example is two-factor authentication. Like if you log into an account and then the system sends you a text message to your phone, or you have to go to an authenticator app on your phone and get a code or enter password or something else, just to make sure that the system really knows who you are. And you can't support something like this without the product teams working that into the user interface. Security is also taking shape in the form of certifications. For example, FedRAMP is a US federal certification process, and it is an extremely high bar to meet, but it is becoming required in order to have contracts signed by more government agencies. Privacy is also something that is gained more and more importance as we share more and more data and with technology companies, and we collect more and more data about our users, more and more content. Several countries have relatively new privacy laws that govern the collection, use, and storage of what's called personally identifiable information, not to mention longer standing regulations in the United States like HIPAA and FERPA. Many of you who serve universities will already be familiar with those kinds of things. Anyone who wants to sell their products or services to the UK you have to have your ducks in a row as far as GDPR, and also thinking about how Brexit may or may not affect those requirements. All of these things can translate in your products into features such as GDPR's the right to be forgotten. So thinking about your products, do you have a privacy scrub or another way that you can dive deeply into your data and remove all of the transactions or personal information regarding a single person? If you think about our products and how sometimes databases feel like these monolithic data stores, how would you actually get in there to remove all of, say, the reference questions asked by a particular professor who doesn't want their information to be represented anymore? So next, how do we bring all of these things together in order to create usable, accessible, and sellable, frankly, software? And how can you bring all of these things together in order to move in the right direction, but also still support existing user needs? Lauren had a set of really great questions to ask yourself. Ask yourselves as you move forward. I have a whole bunch. I have another list of questions that I'm kind of gonna rapid fire at you as well. How have these required formats changed over time? And how do you preserve your content and yet still provide access to it? What are your users' needs? Obviously, they evolve over time. How can you identify your product or software's pain points and think about obviating these, but still maintaining solid user experience and accessibility? You can also think about, and Steph mentioned the product life cycle and how products do eventually come to the end of their life cycle and need to be rethought, remade, or what have you. And in thinking about that, are there features that you can remove? Are there things that nobody uses? Are there things that are just incredibly painful and you need to retract them for a little bit until you can get something better out? What formats are needed? What formats are no longer needed? How can you involve users in your change process? Can you afford to do things like A/B testing of new features, conducting client or user interviews, usability testing, or even involving users in accessibility testing? Is the new technology that you're after compatible with devices and the technology on those devices in the wild? It's important to do not only accessibility and usability testing, but mobile testing, and to keep in mind that sometimes something that is a web standard is more widely usable and accessible than something that is still bleeding edge. What can you do to maintain accessibility, which, as has been mentioned, is a moving target, and to address non-inclusive or culturally insensitive language, mitigate your unconscious bias, also identify those, and support diversity? Are there tools that you can create, for example, to allow your non-technical staff to identify and remove or correct culturally insensitive language? Something in the cataloging world that is interesting to note that is happening right now is, catalogers think of a master record. It's the record of record, and removing that language that refers to master record is something that's going on. Also, are there existing customizations in your software that you have given to customers? Are those compatible with the new technologies and new requirements that you have? Can these customizations be migrated? Do they have to be rewritten? Do they have to be rewritten by you, which means you're dedicating resources to that, or do they have to be rewritten by your users, which means learning on their part, spending time on their part in order to get the look and feel that they're accustomed to? And how can you measure the impact or the adoption of new features? Measuring is called telemetry in technical circles, and using telemetry will help you drive your roadmap in the right direction if you know what is and isn't getting used, where people are running into roadblocks and that sort of thing. And not to mention technical debt, which was already pretty deeply covered in the first session, but I think there are several things that bear repeating. Technical debt comprises potential issues that can pile up if you are just not on top of maintenance. Deliberate technical debt was mentioned. Sometimes you choose the fast way over the best way in order to get something out. To be first to market or to do prototyping or whatever, it is really important to track all of these issues and make sure that they're mitigated as your resources and time allow. Inadvertent tech debt can also pile up if you don't keep an eye on things. An example of this is if you use third-party libraries to bring in some functionality rather than writing that functionality yourself, rather than your development teams doing that as well. It's also important to keep up with the capabilities of the language that you use to actually write your software, and also to modernize your code design patterns, etc. Bit rot was also mentioned, and I think that's just a fantastic phrase. It's something that you just can't get around. Code ages over time, technology moves on, and it is important that your developers always be thinking about refactoring or rewriting the code. And it's important that refactoring is baked into your development culture. And as Steph mentioned, is always a part of those sprints that you do if you are engaged in the Agile process. The type of tech debt that you never want is negligent debt that builds up over time. Again, the third-party library is a good example of that. If you're relying, or a UI framework, if you're relying on that for a really important part of your product and you kind of don't notice there's an upgrade to it, or the thing is just deprecated or abandoned altogether, that can leave you in kind of a lurch. Also, if you have a really, really big code base over time, sometimes the incremental changes that you add can be kind of hard to untangle. So all of this means that creating software, coding software, no longer means one or two people sitting down and writing a whole bunch of scripts that work together over a short amount of time. Software creation is now done with larger and more varied teams that have been mentioned previously that work together. There are technologies and tools that you can use to shorten development time and still incorporate all of these things. For example, there are different ways to design code. The model view controller design pattern of code is one way to create really lean and testable code. This is also one way to enable the separation of content from the presentation of that content. So something that has been going on for a while is creating APIs which can reach into the data layer and pull the data out and then just turn around and present it to the user interface. And so if your user interface is fetching the data via APIs, that data always comes out the same, and it can be handed off to any UI. And so if you need to swap something out really fast, you can do that. It also makes third-party integrations better if you want to present your data in other people's products, etc. The concept of code coverage is a measurement of how testable your code is. Effective developers create additional, when they write a piece of code, they create an additional piece of code that actually tests each of those little capabilities and functions. So having testable code prevents bugs from getting into the wild, because you can use a continuous integration or automation tool like Jenkins is an example of that. And Jenkins kind of sits in the background and runs all of your tests, and it immediately identifies anything that breaks so that it can be fixed before it gets out into production. This isn't really a technology, but having developers review each other's code prevents simple things like typos or an inadequate coding design from getting into that production code. It's just always good to have more than one set of eyes on your code. You can also use frameworks. You can use a large-scale framework like Laravel, which enables faster creation of web applications through its built-in features that can just be dropped into place, as opposed to custom writing your own things. Also, front-end frameworks, and this is one of those third-party libraries that I mentioned. Front-end frameworks like Vue, React, or Angular have reusable components that can also be customized so that your website doesn't look exactly like another website that uses those components. But this leads to much faster development if you can just plop those components into place. Another philosophy that helps speed development is continuous delivery, particularly with library systems. If you think back to updating your ILS or updating an enterprise system, we've often had semi-annual releases or quarterly releases. And effective teams can make use of some of these technologies that I've mentioned, but also server virtualization, containerization to enable smaller releases that are put out more frequently and with no downtime. And just a quick mention of containerization. You can use software like Docker that allows you to package up some small pieces of software so that you can reuse them anytime that you need them rather than having to install packages manually and individually. So all of this adds up, again, to potentially larger teams that have much more diverse skills and need to work very closely together. So when you're ready to roll out software, how do you schedule that disruption for your users? Now, wouldn't this be nice if sitting in a hammock in your favorite spot was the only definition of downtime? But unfortunately, it's not. All of these things together culminate in a release process. And so how do you schedule that? As we know, and we have become painfully aware of over the last year and a half, users want and genuinely need everything to be online and for our systems to be accessible, available 24/7 if we can manage it. In other words, there's just no good time for a true disruption. But there are a couple of different philosophies that can help you determine a path forward. You can choose a low use time, which seems sort of obvious since everyone has their eyes on us when they need. You can analyze traffic and usage patterns to determine when fewer folks are using your products. And it's best to have not only your development team on hand to actually deploy and test the software, but it's also important to have support folks on time to answer questions that may come in as a result of downtime or bugs or whatever, despite how you might communicate that these things might happen. This approach is best for major products that require downtime, migrations, database or OS upgrades, disruptive server work, etc. The con to this is that bugs must be dealt with by staff who are on call, who may already have put in a full day, or maybe it's on the weekend. And the bugs may also be found overnight outside your time zone, resulting in business hours disruption for clients in other locales. This is especially problematic for a PR perspective if they encounter major bugs that aren't caught in post-release testing. And sometimes this happens anyway, in spite of your best preparation. You could also choose to roll out during business hours. I heard everyone go, this does affect the most users, of course, but it also affords you the most staff resources. Your tech, your product, your support teams will be on hand. People will be stressed, of course, but at their best. The pro is that it allows you to address any issues as they're found, but a con to that is that all bugs can feel like big bugs, and it's important to properly assess whether something is an edge case or whether it impacts large numbers of users. This can be problematic from a PR perspective if you have any hiccups at all. One word on that: Twitter. This approach is best when there's no downtime, and you should be mindful that you may not be able to do these smaller, more frequent business hour releases that have been mentioned until you implement some of the technology and tools that I've mentioned, like continuous delivery, etc. Some tools can help you out here. One that non-technical folks may not be familiar with is the concept of lower development environments. So obviously the development team has a setup that allows them to write code and test it with no impact on production. But you can use a system that runs the new code and sits in between the development and the production environment, often called a staging environment, that allows for robust testing before you roll it out. You could also create a server in your production environment that actually is not hit by or facing users. And this will allow you to test how your new code integrates with production code and the production data. There are modern development operations, DevOps procedures and tools that can help with this as well. Cloud service providers like AWS that was mentioned before have features that enable fast server swapping or scaling up without any downtime. There are features that mitigate hardware failure. If you use something called load balancing, you can have 3 or 4 production servers, which you have to pay for, so be mindful of that. But you can have 3 or 4 production servers all in place, and the balancing directs all of your user traffic to the various servers, just so everything is kind of balanced and humming along. And if one server goes down, all that traffic is just directed to a new place, so there's no hiccups. The last thing I'll say is that you should always have a tested rollback process for any time you're doing a release, and you should always have a tested disaster recovery plan. It's really great to write your recovery plan, but if you don't test it, it's helpful to nobody at all. So the biggest takeaway here is that the process of software creation should be a balance of keeping up with user needs, providing new features, maintaining your highly used current features, and maintaining your technology and infrastructure as you go, mitigating that tech debt that's been mentioned a bunch. And I wouldn't be a good librarian if I did not bring you a book recommendation. I recently read this book called The Innovation Delusion, and it is a really good look at how over decades we've talked about innovation. It's the best way to take products forward, but also thinking about innovation in like infrastructure and utilities. But we all must be maintainers because we forget that maintenance at our peril. And that's all I have. Thanks, and I welcome your questions.
Cindi, thank you so much. I'm so enjoying how all of the presentations this morning are kind of fitting together, from the high level down to the kind of some of the messy little details. And as you know, my own organization, NISO, we're having issues with the various modules on our Drupal instance, some of which have been updated, some of which haven't, and the dependencies that are caused by that. Question for you about, you raised the issue of privacy and changing privacy regulations. Want to talk to you, I want to get your thoughts a little bit on how to deal with that from a project or product management perspective, how to deal with it from a software perspective. So it's a different kind of technical debt of we are collecting this information. Oh no, maybe we shouldn't. Or now that we've got it all, there are new regulations about managing it, et cetera. Any strategies that you have about how to maintain, how to stay abreast of those issues? So, you know, programmers are kind of familiar with, oh, there's a new software, there's a new release of an operating system or a new code release. So we need to update our technology for those reasons. How do we stay abreast of the other reasons why we need to maintain code?
I would say for the first thing that comes to mind is for the higher education community, being a member of EDUCAUSE and keeping track, because they're very, very good at keeping track of various technology trends and how you incorporate things like security and privacy into those systems that you support for your university. The other thing that I would say is that you really need to be aware of all of the places that you're collecting personal information and all of the personal information that you are collecting. So if you think about, if you have, for example, a virtual reference system, and you use if it has a ticketing system so you can receive a reference question via email, does the system you're using have the capability to periodically, hopefully on demand, go through and scrub all of that information so that you still retain, oh, this question was asked and these were the research tools that were consulted, here's the inevitable answer, but you no longer know the name of that person, the phone number, the email address, etc. Also, it's important in libraries to think about chat. If you require a name in order to restrict your chat service to your community. If you require personal information to make that happen, then that's something that you need to think about removing as well. And then also think about reporting features of various things, because you could go in and remove the information from big things like the reference questions in the chats, but that information may also have been collected, extracted, and used in exports or whatever for further analysis, surveys where you collect personal information, and think about like where those files can exist in spreadsheets on people's computers and those sorts of things. So it's important to really think widely and deeply about where you're collecting this information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, data proliferates.
Yes.
Another interesting topic that you raised, and one more question before we break for lunch, was about the removal of features. And we tend to plug new things in. We additive, make the system bigger, make the system better. Any strategies for processes that we could put into place about how do we assess what modules or what features exist, and then how do we extract those without breaking other things?
Mm-hmm. First, I think it's important to think about every feature that you put out there is potential tech debt, because it's just more code that you have to maintain. And so to figure out and assess features, data is the most important thing there. If you can, build in measurement systems, whether it's just the amount of, like, say you have a room reservation system and you put out new features, your development team should be able to put in a quick measurement so that they can say, okay, this has been out for a month and X number of people have actually used it or adopted it, added to their system or whatever. There was one other thing I was going to say. Oh, and you're always going to make somebody unhappy taking something away. And so it's really important to communicate that you're going to take something away. If you can provide a workaround to what that feature did, or if you can say, we're taking this feature away, but we're adding a similar capability over here, or we're taking this feature away because it was simply confusing and only a very small number of folks took advantage of it, and the confusion that it created, and you don't have to tell users, but the tech debt that it put on our shoulders was just too great, and we feel like we have to remove it.
Great. Cindi, thank you so much for digging into some of the details and some of the weeds. Again, fantastic talk. Just want to highlight, there's been some interesting chatter in the chat from one of the participants, Christina Drummond. She pointed to an EDUCAUSE page regarding privacy. She has also highlighted the IAPP. I think that's the International Association of Privacy Professionals. Too many acronyms in my world. And then the FPF, which is the Future Privacy Forum. Also great resources for privacy and maintaining privacy, and attentive to those details as we manage some of these questions. So Cindi, thank you